The winter that almost killed the town of Greystone, Montana, did not begin with snow. It began with silence. But that comes later. First, you need to understand what kind of place Greystone was before the storm, before the hunger, before the reckoning that changed everything. And you need to understand the girl. Arden Hale was not a man given to prayer. He had built his faith in straight lines and plumb bobs, in the satisfying thud of a well-driven nail and the clean geometry of a corner joint. He believed in what his hands could make. He believed in what his eyes could see. So when people later asked him to describe the moment he truly understood what Claire Ashwood had done, he never reached for scripture. He reached for memory. He was kneeling in the snow. That much he always remembered clearly. The cold had gone past pain and into something quieter, something that felt almost like acceptance. Around him the world was white and howling and indifferent. And above him, up the long brutal face of Cinder Ridge, a thin thread of smoke rose from the mountain skin. Just smoke, just a thin gray whisper against the bruised sky. But it meant fire, and fire meant warmth, and warmth meant she was alive. He had built the finest houses in 5 counties. Not one of them had survived the night. The girl he had watched walk out of town with nothing but a gray mare and a dead man's tools had built something that the storm could not touch. He knelt in the snow, and he was not ashamed of the tears that froze against his cheeks. This is the story of how that happened. Greystone, Montana in the spring of 1886 was the kind of town that believed in itself with the particular ferocity of a place that had not yet been tested. It sat in the valley below Cinder Ridge like a man leaning back in a chair with his boots on the table, comfortable and confident, and not yet aware that the chair has a cracked leg. The main street ran straight and purposeful, lined with storefronts that wore fresh paint the way a man wears his Sunday suit with effort and intention. There was a bank. There was a church with a clock tower that could be seen from the high ridge on a clear day. There was Sterling's Emporium, renamed and reborn as Voss Mercantile, the grandest building on the street, with glass windows imported from back east, and a wraparound porch where Harlan Voss could stand and survey his domain. And it was his domain. Make no mistake about that. Harlan Voss had come to Greystone 14 years earlier with 3 wagons ahead for numbers, in an absolute conviction that the future belonged to men who moved first and moved decisively. He had been right. He had bought land when land was cheap, sold supplies when supplies were scarce, and extended credit with the careful generosity of a man who understood that debt is its own kind of power. By 1886, there was almost nothing in Greystone that did not pass through Voss's hands in one way or another. The grain, the dry goods, the lumber, the financing for the new schoolhouse. He was not a cruel man exactly. He was something more complicated than cruel. He was a man who had come to believe, through years of unbroken success, that his judgment was simply better than other people's, that his instincts were sharper, that when he looked at a situation and formed a conclusion, the conclusion was correct by virtue of being his. Mayor Roland Pruitt understood this and had spent the better part of a decade making his peace with it. Pruitt was a decent enough man, in the way that many men are decent in easy times, willing to be fair when fairness costs nothing, willing to be kind when kindness asked nothing of him. He had a wife he loved and a garden he tended, and a deep constitutional aversion to conflict that he had long since dressed up in the language of pragmatism. He told himself he managed Voss. What he did was accommodate him. This was the world Clara Ashwood had been born into. And this was the world that in the spring of 1886 had run out of patience for her. Her parents had come to Greystone 3 years earlier, drawn by the geological surveys her father had spent a decade compiling. Edmund Ashwood was not a large man, but he had the quality of stillness that some people mistake for smallness, and others recognize as depth. He could look at a rock face and read it the way a scholar reads a page tracing the story of what had happened there 10,000 years ago, in the language of color and texture and fault lines. His wife Nora was a naturalist with sharp eyes and a sharper memory, who could name every plant in a meadow and tell you which ones would heal you and which ones would kill you, and which ones, prepared correctly, would do a little of both. They had filed a claim on the north face of Cinder Ridge when they arrived, a piece of land that everyone in Greystone agreed was worthless. Barren rock and wind, a steep exposure with no southern warmth, soil too thin to farm. The Ashwoods had smiled politely at the skepticism and gone about their work. Then 18 months after they arrived, they had gone up the mountain and not come back down. The search party found their camp, their tools, their carefully packed specimens. Found no sign of accident, no indication of what had happened. The mountain offered no explanation. It simply kept them. Clara was 12 years old. She had her mother's eyes sharp and careful, cataloging everything they landed on. She had her father's stillness, that quality of interior quiet that people around her consistently underestimated. She had, in the 6 months since her parents' disappearance, learned exactly how much the goodwill of a community is worth, which is to say she had learned that it has a duration, and that duration is shorter than anyone admits. At first, the town had been kind. Women brought food. The preacher spoke of God's provision. Families discussed in careful voices what might be done for the child. Then the discussions had grown quieter. Then the food had stopped coming. Then the conversation shifted from what might be done to the gentle, insistent suggestion that something needed to be resolved. Clara was 12, then 13. She slept where she could. She worked where work was offered. She ate what was available, which was not always very much. She had her parents' maps. She had their books. She had their tools stored in the small lean-to behind the livery, where Sage, her father's gray mare, was stabled on the charity of the livery owner, who had made clear that the charity had a time limit. She was not a child who attracted sympathy easily. She was too quiet for that, too self-contained, too obviously assessing the people around her with those careful eyes. Sympathy in Greystone flowed more readily toward a certain kind of helplessness, toward tears and visible desperation. Clara's desperation was real enough. She just carried it differently, turned inward rather than outward, processed rather than performed. This did not serve her well. It was the third week of May when it happened. The afternoon was warm, the kind of warm that softens people, that makes generosity feel natural, and meanness feel like effort. Clara had not eaten since the previous morning. Not because food was unavailable in Greystone, but because she had no money and no credit, and had exhausted one by one the small kindnesses of neighbors who had their own families to feed. She was walking past Voss Mercantile when she saw the barrel. It sat beside the front door, half full of apples from the previous autumn's harvest, shriveled now, and soft, their skin gone brown and loose. They were destined, as she well knew, for the pigs that Voss kept behind the building. The pigs would eat them without ceremony or gratitude. Her stomach made a sound that she had learned to ignore. She did not make a decision exactly. The hand moved before the mind caught up. One apple small and soft and smelling of fermentation and better days. She closed her fingers around it and turned to walk away. The voice stopped her like a hand on the collar. Thief. Harlan Voss had the kind of voice that had never needed to be raised to command attention. It carried naturally with the confidence of a man who had spent decades being listened to. He stood on the porch of his mercantile in his good wool coat, and he looked at Clara the way a man looks at a problem that has been accumulating for some time and has finally presented itself for resolution. She turned to face him. She did not run. Later people would remark on this, the fact that she had not run, and some of them would call it courage, and some of them would call it stupidity, and some of them would recognize it for what it actually was, which was the quiet dignity of a person who has already lost most of what can be taken. He crossed the porch and removed the apple from her hand with the deliberate care of a man reclaiming property. Just like your parents, he said, taking what doesn't belong to them. It was a remarkable thing to say about a family in which both parents had recently and mysteriously died. Clara looked at him and said nothing. Mayor Roland Pruitt's office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where difficult conversations had been held for many years. The afternoon light came through the single window at a low angle, illuminating the dust in the air, and Pruitt sat behind his desk with the expression of a man who would very much like to be somewhere else. Harlan Voss stood to the right, which somehow managed to feel like the position of authority. Beside him stood two members of the town councilmen, whose names appeared on official documents and whose opinions tracked Voss's with the faithfulness of compass needles tracking north. Clara stood in the middle of the room. She was 13 years old, thin in the way that means not enough food, with dark circles under those careful eyes, and hands that were rougher than they should have been for her age. She stood straight. She held her hands still at her sides. She looked at Pruitt. "What do you have to say for yourself?" the mayor asked. He was looking at the desk when he said it. I was hungry, Clara said. Her voice was steady and quiet. They were going to the pigs. Pruitt's jaw moved slightly as though he were composing something he would not say. Property is property. Voss's voice filled the room the way smoke fills a room, occupying every corner without effort. We cannot have theft in this town. The law does not make exceptions for motivation. If we make exceptions, we invite chaos. Pruitt looked at Clara. She looked back at him. In that exchange of looks, something passed that was not quite communication and not quite conscience, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. She has no family? Voss continued. No means. She has been a burden on the generosity of this community for 6 months, and generosity, like any resource, has limits. He paused. In the pause, the room was very quiet. Her parents filed a claim on the north face of Cinder Ridge, he said, before their accident. That claim passes to her. Let her have it. Let her go there and make what she can of it. He said it with the smooth reasonableness of a man proposing a sensible administrative solution. He said it with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was proposing, which was not a solution at all. The north face of Cinder Ridge was barren. It was exposed. It received no direct sunlight in winter. The soil where there was soil was volcanic rock dust, too thin to support crops. There was no shelter, no water source, nothing. Sending a 13-year-old girl up that mountain alone in May was not a land grant. It was a death sentence with paperwork. Pruitt's hands moved on the desk, a small, helpless motion that he stopped when he became aware of it. Mr. Voss, he said, she's a child. She is a thief, Voss said with the patient finality of a man correcting a simple error. She claims her parents taught her about the land, about geology, about how to read terrain. His eyes moved to Clara, and there was something in them that was not quite contempt and not quite curiosity, but held elements of both. Let's see what their teaching is worth. He looked back at the mare. She takes the horse and her parents' tools, and she is gone by sunrise. If she is found in this valley again, she will be remanded to the territorial authorities. Pruitt looked at Clara. Clara looked at the map on the wall behind the mayor's desk. She had seen this map before. Her father had a copy of it covered in his small, precise handwriting notes and measurements and observations accumulated over years of careful work. She knew where Cinder Ridge sat on that map. She knew what her father had marked there before everything had gone wrong. A thought moved through her mind, quiet and clear as a current in a deep stream. I can survive there, she said. The room went still in a different way. Her voice had not changed. It was still steady, still quiet. But something in it had shifted some quality that the people in the room responded to without quite understanding why. She looked at Voss for the first time. My father showed me the signs. There is warmth in that mountain. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, something between the two. Warmth in the mountain, he repeated. He shook his head. The girl has gone simple. He turned back to Pruitt. Sunrise. The news moved through Greystone the way news always moves in small towns, which is to say it moved faster than was quite explicable and arrived slightly changed from what had actually occurred. By evening it was settled. By midnight everyone knew. By the time the sun came up the next morning, it seemed as though half the town had found reasons to be on the main street. They were not there because they were cruel. Most of them were not cruel people. They were there for the same reason people slow down when they pass an accident, because something significant is happening, and significance draws the living, like water draws the thirsty. Because in a town where not much changes, the exile of a 13-year-old girl is at minimum something to witness. Clara had packed before dawn. She worked in the lean-to behind the livery with a lamp turned low, loading her parents' belongings onto the sled with the methodical care of someone who has thought carefully about weight and necessity. The geological maps, her father's careful notations marking every feature of Cinder Ridge. Her mother's journal, its pages thick with pressed plants and observations about the natural world. The tools, the pickaxe and the shovel and the hand drill and the various implements of a geologist's trade, heavy and purposeful. A canvas pack of heirloom seeds her mother had stored wrapped in oilcloth against moisture. Rope, a skinning knife, 2 blankets. Sage stood quietly while she was harnessed to the sled. The mare was 12 years old, gray through her muzzle now, and she had a steadiness that Clara had come to rely on in the months since her parents' disappearance. Sage did not startle easily. She worked without complaint. She would follow Clara anywhere. There are worse companions for an exile. Clara led the mare out of the livery into the early morning light, and the town was there waiting. She did not look at most of them. She was aware of their presence the way you are aware of weather as a condition of the environment rather than a collection of individuals. There were words. There were the particular sounds that a crowd makes when it is performing disapproval for itself, a low murmur that is half judgment and half theater. Harlan Voss stood on the porch of the Mercantile, arms crossed, watching with the satisfaction of a man whose affairs are proceeding in order. She was almost to the edge of town when something was pressed into her hand. She looked down. A small cloth bag nodded at the top. She looked up. Crispin Hale was 16 taller than his father and nowhere near as sure of himself. He had the look of a young man who thought more than he spoke and felt things more acutely than he showed. And in this particular moment, he looked as though he wanted very much to say something and could not locate the words. He said nothing. He pressed the bag into her hand and stepped back. She turned the bag over. Inside through the cloth, she could feel the shape of seeds. Dozens of them, maybe more. She looked at Crispin for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite gratitude, but something genuine, something that had not been there before. Then she turned and led Sage north toward the mountain. She did not look back at Greystone, but for just a moment she looked at the map she carried in her memory, the one with her father's markings, the one with the X on the north face of Cinder Ridge, and the note her father had written beside it in his small, careful hand. She did not know yet what waited in the mountain. She knew only what her father had told her in late evenings by lamplight, about the way the earth breathes in certain places, about the warmth that escapes from deep within it, about the signs a careful person can learn to read. She was a careful person. The town fell away behind her. The mountain rose ahead. The morning air was cold and clean against her face. She walked toward it. The north face of Cinder Ridge was everything the town had said it was. It was also in ways the town could not see and had never tried to see something more. Clara spent the first 3 days simply observing. This was her father's method, the foundational habit he had drilled into her from the time she was old enough to follow him through fieldwork. Before you act, observe. Before you conclude, accumulate evidence. The land will tell you what it is if you ask it with patience. She made camp in a shallow depression near the base of the ridge, where a cluster of ancient juniper trees broke the worst of the wind. She let Sage graze on the sparse vegetation in the lower areas, while she climbed systematically, carefully reading the rock face the way her father had taught her, looking for what she knew to look for. On the morning of the second day, she found it. A breath. That was the only word for it, standing above a narrow cleft in the rock 20 feet above the juniper line. A faint upward movement of air that was unmistakably warmer than the air around it, carrying with it the mineral smell her father had described, sulfur and damp stone, and something older than either, a deep earth smell that meant the planet's interior was close to the surface here. Her father had marked this place on his map. She stood over it for a long time, feeling the warmth rise against her face, and she thought of her father standing in this exact spot, perhaps at this exact time of year, feeling what she was feeling now. The mountain breathes here, he had told her. The earth keeps its heat close to the surface. A person who understood that, who worked with it rather than against it, could survive almost anything. She had been a child then, sitting beside him in the lamplight, listening to his stories about geology, the way other children listened to fairy tales. She had not fully understood. She understood now. The cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of juniper growth, so well concealed that she almost missed it, despite knowing roughly where to look. Her father's map had been precise, but the mountain had grown over his markings in the 2 years since he had made them. She found it on the afternoon of the third day, a horizontal crack in the rock face, perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, the junipers pressing close on both sides. She had to turn sideways to get through the entrance. Beyond it, the space opened, not dramatically, not into the vast cathedral of imagination, but meaningfully into a chamber perhaps 15 feet wide and 10 feet high and 30 feet deep, the rocks smooth and dark, the floor sandy, and at the back, through a narrower passage, the sound of water. And warmth, not the warmth of fire or the warmth of bodies. A steady, persistent geological warmth rising from the ground itself, from the water, she could hear in the passage beyond. The air was damp and still, and she estimated perhaps 40 degrees warmer than the air outside. She stood in the entrance of that cave in the dim afternoon light, filtering through the junipers, and she breathed it in and she understood, for the first time completely, what her father had been trying to tell her. Then she went back to her camp and she brought the lamp. And in the back passage by the lamp's yellow light, she found the steaming spring. It was small, perhaps 2 feet across, where it bubbled up from a fissure in the rock, the water hot to the touch and faintly sulphurous, running for about 8 feet across the passage floor before disappearing into another crack in the stone. Steam rose from it steadily. The air around it was warm enough that she removed her coat. And wedged into a crevice in the rock wall wrapped in oilcloth was a leather satchel. She knew her father's initials before she opened it. EA stamped into the leather with the brass stamp he had carried in his kit. Inside, his field journal. She sat down on the warm stone beside the steaming spring, and she opened the journal and she read. It took her the rest of that afternoon and most of the following morning. It was a geological record, precise and detailed everything her father had observed about Cinder Ridge over 2 years of careful study. The thermal activity, the lava tube system that ran through the mountain's core, the soil composition in the protected areas volcanic and mineral rich, the water table, the light patterns on the north face during different seasons, and more than that, diagrams, plans, a sketch of what the cave could become if it were expanded along the existing lava tubes, a plan for diverting a portion of the thermal spring into a channel that would warm a growing area. Notes about reflective minerals, the deposits of mica her mother had identified, and their potential use for amplifying available light. It was not just a geological record, it was a blueprint. On the last page in her father's small, careful handwriting, a single line. Not addressed to anyone, not signed, just written as if he were writing it to himself at the end of a day's work. The mountain doesn't forgive pride, but it rewards patience. Clara sat beside the warm water in the belly of the mountain, where her father had worked and planned, and she understood now, prepared. Not for himself, for her. For someone he must have known on some level might need this place. She was not given to easy tears. She had learned in the months since her parents' disappearance to process grief in the way she processed everything quietly internally in the space between one breath and the next. But she allowed herself in that warm underground room, with her father's handwriting in her hands, one moment of something that was grief and wonder and fierce sustaining love all at once. Then she folded the journal closed. Then she went outside and looked at the mountain and began to make plans. She worked alone for 6 months. Alone is not quite the right word because Sage was there. And in the way of horses who have been with one person long enough, Sage was more companion than animal, responsive to Clara's moods, in a way that required no language and offered something that felt in the long, lonely hours of that first summer like genuine comfort. But in practical terms, she was one person 13 years old doing work that would normally require several grown men and appropriate equipment. She did it anyway. She started by expanding the cave entrance, chipping at the rock with the hand drill and the pickaxe her father had left among his tools, working methodically along the natural fault lines her father's journal had identified. The rock here was not the densest she might have encountered. The volcanic geology that created the thermal activity also created relative softness in certain formations, places where the pickaxe could find purchase and the drill could open channels. She was not large, but she was precise. She had learned from her father to let the tool do the work to find the grain of the stone and follow it rather than fighting it, to be patient where impatience would waste energy and decisive where decisiveness would save it. She timbered the ceiling as she went, using scavenged logs from the dead trees on the lower ridge and the timber framing skills her father had learned in a mine years before and passed on to her in the same casual, practical way he had passed on everything he knew. She was not building for aesthetics. She was building for function, for safety, for longevity. Sage pulled the debris out on a drag sled Clara fashioned from her father's materials. Back and forth the mare patient and willing the load of broken rock and displaced soil accumulating in a pile at the base of the ridge. Clara calculated the weight of each load. She tracked Sage's energy and hydration the way she tracked her own, with the careful attention of someone who understood that her survival and the mare's survival were the same survival. The main chamber expanded to 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. She diverted a portion of the thermal spring into a shallow channel she carved along the eastern wall, running it the length of the growing space before allowing it to rejoin the natural fissure. This created a passive heating system of remarkable effectiveness. The channel warmed the air in the chamber, raised the humidity to a level that would support plant growth, and provided a continuous water source. She capped it with flat stones in places to prevent excessive evaporation and left it open in others to maximize the warming effect. The temperature in the chamber settled at approximately 55 degrees, steady across seasons maintained entirely by the Earth's own heat. She partitioned off a section at the chamber's far end for sage deep enough for comfort, close enough to the main entrance for adequate ventilation. She lined the walls of this section with the densest timbering building, a space that would hold warmth against even the worst exterior cold. Light was the hardest problem. The chamber faced north, which meant no direct sunlight. The entrance admitted some ambient light during daylight hours, but not enough for plant growth. She spent 2 weeks on this problem alone, working through her mother's notes in the field journal, testing different configurations of the mica deposits she found in the ridge's geological formations. Her mother had written about mica with the particular excitement she reserved for things that surprised her. The deposits on Cinder Ridge were extensive and accessible thin sheets of the mineral that could be split and worked with relatively simple tools. The optical properties were not equivalent to glass, but they were not nothing. A carefully positioned sheet of mica, angled to receive what light existed, and directed inward, could double or triple the effective illumination in a given area. Clara built a series of reflective panels from split mica sheets mounted on frames of straight-grained wood at the angles her mother's notes specified. She positioned them at the cave entrance and in the passage connecting the entrance to the main chamber. She tested and adjusted, spending full days observing how the light moved through the mountain shadow at different hours. The result was not sunlight. It was a pale, diffuse, slightly silvery illumination that fell unevenly across the chamber floor. It was not what she had hoped for. It was enough. She built growing beds along the floor, terraced slightly, to manage drainage, filling them with the volcanic soil from the debris she had excavated mixed with guano from the bat colony that occupied a higher cave on the ridge. The mixture was, as her father's journal had predicted, extraordinarily fertile, rich in minerals, warm from below, consistently moist from the proximity of the thermal channel. In late October of 1886 she planted. From her mother's preserved seed stock she chose with care. Kale, which is hardy and cold tolerant and nutrient dense. Potatoes, which can grow in low light if the soil's warm enough. Carrots, slower but lasting. Mushroom spores from her mother's collection species that thrive in low light and high humidity, that need not sunlight at all, but only the right conditions. She did not know in those first weeks if it would work. She watched the beds with the intensity of someone for whom failure was not an abstract outcome. She checked the temperature of the soil with her hands every morning. She monitored the humidity by feel and by the behavior of the bat colony, which seemed to offer a reliable index of atmospheric conditions in the chamber. She adjusted the mica panels as the angle of winter light changed outside. On the 14th day of November 1886, the first green shoot emerged from the kale bed. She sat in the soft earth beside it for a long time, not touching it, just watching it exist. Down in Greystone, they talked about her the way people talk about things that exist at the edges of their awareness, with a mixture of mild curiosity, comfortable dismissal, and the occasional flicker of something that might have been conscious if it had been allowed to develop. Hunters and trappers moving through the high country brought back reports. The Ashwood girl was still up there, still digging, still working that barren face like she expected something to come of it. The reports were received with amusement. Harlan Voss, when he heard them, felt what he would later acknowledge much later in a different voice as a small, uncomfortable thing beneath his certainty. Not doubt, not quite. More like the distant sound of something he chose not to listen to. He was in the autumn of 1886 occupied with larger matters. The harvest had been adequate. The town was growing. He had begun discussions with a construction firm about a new warehouse, a proper commercial storehouse that would allow him to buy and hold grain in quantity to position Greystone as a regional trading hub. The numbers were impressive. $4,000 was a significant investment, but the return projections were compelling. Arden Hale, who was the finest builder in the region, was engaged to design it. He drew plans for something worthy of Voss's ambitions, a structure with real presence, high walls of good timber, a proper roof, a cellar, something that said permanence, something that said prosperity. The timber was sourced and delivered in the early spring of 1887. There was some discussion about cure time. Hale mentioned it briefly in passing, that green timber needs time to stabilize before it will seal properly in extreme cold. Voss had looked at his timeline and his projections and made the practical decision. The warehouse would be completed by summer. The timber would cure sufficiently in place. This was the kind of decision that seems in retrospect to have an almost geometric inevitability, each angle leading to the next, each small compromise, opening the door for a larger one. But in the spring of 1887, in the comfortable warmth of ongoing success, it was simply a decision, one of hundreds. No one gave it particular thought. By the autumn of 1887, the Gopher's Palace was complete. That was what they called it in Greystone, the Gopher's Palace, a name born in mockery and carried easily by the kind of casual cruelty that doesn't think of itself as cruel. She's building herself a palace up there, like a gopher in the ground. The name traveled through the town's conversations and settled into its language, a piece of local humor that people used without thinking much about it. In the actual structure on the north face of Cinder Ridge, separated from that mockery by distance and altitude, and everything that distance implies, Clara Ashwood stood in the entrance of the main chamber and looked at what she had made. It was not beautiful by the standards of the world she had come from. The walls were rough stone and timber, functional and without ornament. The growing beds were wooden frames in dark soil. The mica panels threw their pale light in pools across the chamber floor. The thermal channel ran along the eastern wall, its surface faintly steaming in the cooler air near the entrance. In the partition section at the far end, Sage moved in the darkness, the sound of her breathing slow and regular. From the kale beds, green leaves spread in quiet abundance. The mushroom beds along the north wall had established themselves in orderly profusion, gray-capped and solid. The potato beds were dense with foliage, the underground development proceeding in the warm, dark soil below. The carrot beds were slower but growing. The air smelled of earth and moisture, and faintly of something living. Clara was 14 years old. She had built this alone. She had followed her father's blueprint and her mother's knowledge and her own careful, patient, unrelenting effort, and she had made something that the world outside could not diminish. She was in ways she could not fully articulate happy. Not the happiness of comfort or ease, not the happiness of having enough. The deeper, more durable happiness of alignment, of being precisely where and what she was meant to be, of having trusted something uncertain and finding it solid. She sat in the entrance of her home and looked out at the valley below where the lights of Greystone flickered in the early dark of late autumn, and she opened her father's journal to the last page. The mountain doesn't forgive pride, but it rewards patience. She read it twice. She closed the journal. She held it against her chest for a moment. Far below in the valley, Harlan Voss was signing paperwork on the new warehouse. The timbers of its walls, green and not yet fully cured, held their shape against the mild autumn air. The roof was tight and the cellar was deep, and the grain that would fill it in the coming weeks was the best harvest Greystone had seen in years. Above on the mountain's north face, the wind was picking up, coming down from the north, with a new edge that Clara noticed and filed away in the careful index of her observations. Something in the air was different. She did not know yet what it meant. She knew only that she had learned to pay attention to such things, that the mountain and the animals on it and the atmosphere above it were all speaking in a language her father had spent years teaching her to read. She would keep watching. She closed the journal, tucked it into its place beside her sleeping roll, and went to check the thermal channel before sleep. Behind her in the valley, the lights of Greystone burned steadily against the gathering dark. The autumn of 1888 was coming. Neither the mountain nor its patient occupant was finished yet. The summer of 1888 was the most beautiful summer anyone in Greystone could remember. That is worth noting. Not because beauty is suspicious, though sometimes it is, but because the particular quality of that summer, its warmth and its abundance and its easy generosity, was the thing that made what came after so complete in its devastation. A hard year prepares people. A beautiful year does something else entirely. It opens them up. It convinces them that the world is at its core on their side. Greystone opened up that summer like a man who has just received very good news and cannot quite believe his luck and does not want to examine it too carefully for fear the examination will dissolve it. The fields came in heavy. The wheat stood tall and full-headed, more grain per acre than the oldest farmers could recall from their deepest memories. The corn was strong, the kitchen gardens overflowed. The root cellars filled early, and people went about their August work with the particular lightness of those who know the winter is provided for, who have looked at their stores and found them sufficient and then some. Harlan Voss looked at the harvest numbers and felt the satisfaction of a man whose instincts have been confirmed. He had positioned Greystone as a regional hub. He had built the warehouse. He had extended credit to the right farmers, purchased grain futures at the right moment, structured the commercial relationships in Greystone exactly as he had planned. And now the harvest had validated every decision. He stood on the porch of his mercantile in those long August evenings and watched the wagons come in from the fields, and felt, not for the first time but with unusual intensity, that deep animal pleasure of being right. On Cinderer Ridge, 1,100 feet above the valley floor, Clara Ashwood was watching rabbits. She had been watching them for 3 weeks. The snowshoe hares that inhabited the terrain around the ridge were animals she knew well by now, their patterns and rhythms as familiar to her as the thermal channel's morning temperature, and the particular sound Sage made when she was unsettled. Clara had spent 2 years learning the language of this mountain, and she had become fluent in ways that took time and attention and a willingness to be still. The hares were not behaving normally. In a normal summer, they would be busy enough in August, fattening for the cold season, but there was a quality to their current activity that was different, a register of urgency that Clara could feel more than describe. They were not simply feeding, they were accumulating, moving faster than the temperature required, covering more ground. Their behavior had a driven quality, as if something below conscious calculation was telling them that ordinary preparation was not going to be sufficient. She noted it in the journal she had begun keeping in her father's style, small and precise recording observations without interpretation, until the observations accumulated enough weight to support a conclusion. She moved to the marmots next. The marmot colony on the western exposure of the ridge had been consistent in its hibernation timing for 2 years running, going to ground in the 3rd week of September. This year, in the last days of August, they were already retreating. Not all of them, not yet, but the older animals, the ones that had survived the most winters, were disappearing into their burrows almost a full month ahead of schedule. Clara wrote this down. Then she went to the northern exposure where the wind came down off the higher peaks without interruption, and she stood for a long time with her face into it. The wind in August should carry the last warmth of the high summer, being the residual heat of the alpine meadows, the sun-warmed rock. What she felt instead was something that did not belong to August. A cutting quality, an edge that was not cold, exactly not yet, but that promised cold the way a particular shade of cloud promises rain, not as metaphor, but as direct information if you know how to receive it. She went back to the chamber and looked at her stores. Adequate, more than adequate by the standards of the 2 winters she had already survived on the ridge. A normal winter would not challenge what she had. She thought about the hares. She thought about the marmots. She thought about that edge in the wind. She began hauling additional firewood. Not for heat, the thermal channel managed that without wood. For cooking. For the extra margin that something in the mountain's behavior was telling her she should want. She worked through the first weeks of September with an intensity that went beyond her usual careful preparation, and she did not fully understand why until the morning she climbed to the high point of the ridge with her father's instrument for measuring barometric pressure and found the reading lower than she had ever recorded it. Much lower. She came back down to the chamber and sat for a long time with the journal open in her lap and wrote nothing because she did not yet have the language for the scale of what the instruments and the animals in the wind were collectively suggesting. She reinforced the hide panels over the chamber entrance instead. She checked every timber joint in the ceiling. She ran her hands along the thermal channel's stone edging and repacked the mortar where 2 winters of settling had opened small gaps. She did not know what was coming. She knew something was coming. The kicking ceremony for the new warehouse had been Voss's idea, and it had been, by any measure, a success. He had organized it for the 2nd Saturday of October, timing it to coincide with the completion of the harvest delivery so that the warehouse could be formally inaugurated with grain actually inside it. This was deliberate. He wanted people to see the building full, to understand in their bodies as well as their minds what it meant to have this capacity, this reserve, this commercial infrastructure. Art and Hale had done fine work. The building stood at the eastern edge of the commercial district with the solidity and presence of something permanent, its timber walls broad and straight, its roof pitched at the correct angle for snow, load its cellar accessed by a double door set flush with the ground. It was, by any honest assessment, a handsome piece of construction. The town turned out in force. There was whiskey which Voss had provided from his own stock as a gesture of civic generosity. There was food from the community's women pies and bread and the substantial abundance of a harvest season kitchen. There were children running between adult legs and a general atmosphere of well-being that was real, not performed. Voss spoke from a small platform Hale had built for the occasion. He spoke well. He always spoke well. He talked about what Greystone had built together, about the vision of a community that could sustain itself through its own effort and foresight, about the warehouse as a symbol of that vision made physical. He talked about the harvest, the best in memory. He talked about the winter ahead with the confidence of a man who has looked at the numbers and found them favorable. Providence has smiled upon us, he said. This town is secure. No one here shall know hunger. The whiskey was good, and the crowd was warm, and the grain was visible through the open warehouse doors stacked in orderly abundance. It was the kind of moment that feels in the living of it like confirmation of everything you believed about yourself and your choices. It was at this moment that old Calhoun stood up. Emmett Calhoun was 71 years old and had been in Montana longer than most of the people in Greystone had been alive. He had come west in the 1830s as a young man with a trapping outfit and had stayed because he lacked the particular kind of imagination required to picture himself elsewhere. He had wintered in places and conditions that would be difficult to describe to someone who had not experienced them. He had seen weather in all its registers, the ordinary and the severe and the genuinely catastrophic. He was not a man who said much. When he did say something, it tended to be specific. He rose from the edge of the crowd, not pushing forward, just standing where he was, and he waited until Voss had finished speaking, because he was not a rude man either. Then he said in the carrying voice of someone accustomed to making himself heard outdoors, "There are signs this year I have not seen since '56. The crowd shifted slightly. Voss looked at him from the platform with the patient expression of a man exercising restraint. '56, Calhoun continued, was the winter that took the Blackfoot camps on the Two Medicine and the settler families on the Marias. 40 below for 3 weeks. Snow that buried a standing horse. I saw it. I am telling you what the signs look like before a winter like that. The animals are telling you. The wind is telling you. I have seen this before." He stopped. He did not elaborate. He had said what he came to say. Harlan Voss looked at Emmett Calhoun for a moment. The crowd waited, reading Voss as crowds do, for the cue to how this should be received. Voss smiled. It was not an unkind smile, which made it worse. "Emmett," he said with the warm condescension of a man speaking to someone who should be accorded respect without being taken seriously, "we appreciate your experience. We do, but we have full stores, a sound building, and the best harvest in memory. I think we are in somewhat different circumstances than the families on the Marias." The crowd responded. Not with cruelty, with the gentle, collective exhale of people who have been given permission to dismiss the thing that made them briefly uncomfortable. There were smiles. There was a murmur of agreement. Someone laughed quietly, not at Calhoun exactly, but in the direction of his concern. Arden Hale, standing at the edge of the platform, looked at the warehouse walls. He thought briefly about the timber, about the cure time he had mentioned and Voss had waved past, about what green timber does in extreme cold, how it shrinks, how the joints that hold fine in moderate conditions open up when the temperature drops past a certain threshold. He said nothing. He told himself later that the concern was minor, that the building was fundamentally sound, that he was perhaps overthinking a detail that an experienced builder knew how to manage. He told himself this. He did not entirely believe it. Emmett Calhoun sat back down. He did not argue. He was not a man who argued with crowds. He had said what he came to say. The truth of it would stand or fall on its own terms. He looked from his seat at the edge of the gathering toward the dark shape of Cinder Ridge against the northern sky. He had heard, as everyone in Greystone had heard, about the girl up there, about what she was building. The trapper's reports had trickled down over 2 years, and he had listened to them with more attention than most. That child on the ridge, he said to himself, quiet enough that no one around him heard it. That child understands something the rest of you don't. He finished his whiskey and went home. The morning of October 29th, 1888, was strange in a way that people remembered afterward with the clarity that the mind reserves for things that precede catastrophe. The temperature, which had been settling toward a normal late October cold in the days before, rose unexpectedly. By mid-morning, it was 40 degrees warm enough that several people commented on it, the odd gift of an Indian summer extension, perhaps. Children played without their heavy coats. A woman hung washing on the line. The air was absolutely still. The stillness was the wrong kind, not the stillness of a calm day which breathes and moves even in its quietness. This was a vacuum stillness, a held breath stillness, as if the atmosphere itself were compressing in preparation for something. At 2 in the afternoon, the sky to the northwest turned a color that no one had a ready word for. Not gray, not purple. Something between them that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The animals in Greystone's barns and paddocks began to behave badly. Horses pressed to the backs of their stalls. Cattle would not eat. Dogs disappeared under porches and would not come out. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes. Then the wall arrived. There is no better word for it. Witnesses described it the same way independently as a wall. A solid vertical mass of white that moved across the northern horizon and then across the middle ground. And then there was no horizon and no middle ground because it was everywhere, and the sound it brought was so large that it registered less as sound than as physical pressure. The wind and the snow together and at 60 miles an hour driving south and east with a force that is genuinely difficult to imagine if you have not stood in the path of it. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in less than an hour. 40 degrees to 10 below zero in 60 minutes. Greystone had not been built for this. No settlement of its era and its architecture had been built for this because what descended on the valley that October afternoon was not a severe winter storm. It was a different category of event, entirely the kind of meteorological occurrence that happens rarely enough that the living memory of a community does not retain it, that slips between generations and loses its warning weight, so that each new group of people who encounter it does so without adequate preparation, because the people who survived the last one are dead. The houses that Arden Hale had built over the years were the finest in the region, wide windows to catch the light, high ceilings for air circulation, carefully fitted joints and good pitched roofs, beautiful functional structures built for the climate of Greystone as it normally was. The windows shattered within hours. The cold came through them like a fist through paper, families packed into back rooms, into kitchens, burning furniture when the firewood ran low. The ceilings that had been assets in summer became liabilities in winter, vaulting spaces that could not be heated to safety. The snow accumulated with a speed that compressed days into the feeling of hours. By the end of the first day, it was past the window ledges. By the second day, it covered the lower windows entirely. Doors that had opened outward became sealed from outside, the drifts packing against them with the weight and density of packed earth. Roofs began to report the stress load in sounds, long groaning complaints that people heard through their blankets and did not want to interpret. The clock tower of the church was the first to go on the third day, its weight defeating the roof below it with a sound that was felt in the chest as much as heard, a concussive drop that people thought, half asleep in their cold dark houses, was thunder. It was not thunder. In the warehouse, the process was slower and worse. Arden Hale had built the structure with genuine skill. It was sound in its fundamental architecture. But the timber green, when installed, had spent the summer and fall drying in place. When the temperature dropped to levels no one in the valley had experienced in their lifetimes, the drying became shrinking. The joints that had been tight in October became fractional gaps in the new cold. Not large gaps, fractions of an inch, but fractions of an inch at 60 below zero wind chill with snow driving horizontally are enough. The snow sifted in, fine as powder, cold as iron. It settled on the grain sacks nearest the walls. At first, this was a minor thing, a dusting of white on burlap. But the temperature inside the warehouse, despite its insulation, was dropping toward a point where moisture behaved differently, where the chemistry of grain and water and cold combined in ways that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with biology. Harlan Voss was in the warehouse when he first noticed. He had gone to check the stores on the second day of the storm, forcing his way through the drift that had piled against the interior-facing door, with the grim determination of a man fulfilling an obligation. He had brought a lamp. The grain near the western wall was wet, not soaked, damp. A darkening of the burlap that could have been shadow except that the lamp was positioned to eliminate shadow from this angle. He stood in the lamp's circle of light and looked at the damp burlap for what felt like a very long time. He knew what this was. He had known grain all his life, bought and sold and stored it for 14 years. He knew that damp grain in a sealed space was not simply damp grain. He knew the process that began when moisture and ambient warmth and organic material combined in the absence of circulation. He knew it moved quickly. He knew that the time between detectable and unrecoverable was shorter than people thought. The correct decision in this moment was to alert the town, to organize a response even in the teeth of the storm, to open the warehouse to air, to move grain, to do whatever could be done to salvage what could be salvaged. He stood in the lamp's light and he thought about the ceremony 2 weeks earlier, about the crowd and the whiskey and the confidence in his own voice when he had said, "Providence has smiled upon us." He thought about Emmett Calhoun sitting at the edge of that crowd and saying what he had come to say. He thought about what it would mean to walk into the street in this storm and tell the people of Greystone that the warehouse was failing. He adjusted his lamp and went back through the drift to his house. He told himself there was nothing to be done in this storm anyway. He told himself waiting 2 days would not make a significant difference. He told himself this in the specific voice of a man who knows he is telling himself a lie and is making the active choice to accept it. He waited, not 2 days. He waited 48 hours. 48 hours during which the temperature inside the warehouse continued to drop, during which the snow continued to sift through the shrinking joints, during which the damp darkened and spread across the burlap, and the process that he had interrupted with his silence continued without interruption. When he finally opened the warehouse to others on the 4th day of the storm, the grain near the walls was a solid mass of frozen mold. By the 6th day, when the true extent became undeniable, the store was not partly compromised. It was gone. Up on Cinder Ridge, the storm arrived as sound before it arrived as anything else. Clara had been in the chamber when the change in pressure made Sage lift her head and shift her feet in the restless way that meant something outside was different. Clara had gone to the entrance and looked out through the hide panel she had reinforced 2 weeks earlier and seen the sky color that she had no word for, and she had pulled the panel back into place and secured its edges and gone to check each item on the mental list she had been building since August. Thermal channel running, mica panels secured, timber joints packed, firewood for cooking stacked inside the entrance passage out of the wind, stores checked and rechecked, food for a long winter present, water the thermal spring provided continuously, animals Sage and the 2 goats in their partitioned sections warm calm fed. She went through the list. Everything was in order. Then the storm came and the world outside the chamber ceased to exist. She could hear it. Even through the rock, even through the timber, even through the snowpack that accumulated over the entrance and became within the first day a perfect insulating layer that raised the ambient temperature inside the chamber by several degrees, she could hear it. The wind had a voice unlike any she had experienced, a sustained roar that was not a weather event, but a geological one, a force on the scale of the mountain itself. She lit her tallow lamp and she looked at her garden. The kale was in its autumn flush, dark and abundant. The potato beds had been harvested in September and replanted for a second cycle, the new growth already 3 inches above the soil. The mushroom beds along the north wall were producing steadily. She had dried meat from a successful rabbit trapping in October, jerked and stored in a sealed crock. She had goat's milk warm from the animals in their adjacent section. She sat in the warm chamber with the storm howling somewhere beyond the stone and the timber and the snow, and she thought about the valley below. She did not think about it often. She had, by deliberate practice, organized her mind around the present and the immediate, the tasks of the day, the health of the plants, the condition of the animals, the readings from her instruments. Dwelling on Greystone and what she had been sent from it accomplished nothing and cost something. She had learned this in the first winter and had practiced the discipline of it until it became habitual. But sitting with the storm all around her, she allowed herself to wonder. The warehouse would have stores. Whatever Harlan Voss's faults, he was a man who prepared commercially. The town had had its best harvest in memory. They were probably all right down there. They were probably all right. She heated water over the small cooking fire near the entrance and made herself a meal of roasted potato and steamed kale, and she ate it slowly, listening to the mountain, and she did not think about the valley again that night. On the ninth day, the storm did not end so much as it paused. The roaring subsided. The wind dropped from its sustained, impossible velocity to something merely brutal. The snowfall continued, but changed character, shifting from the horizontal drive of the blizzard's peak to a vertical fall, still heavy, still accumulating, but recognizable again as weather rather than catastrophe. In Greystone, they dug out, or tried to. The houses at the center of town had survived structurally, their walls intact, their roofs mostly holding. But the snow had covered them to the eaves and in some cases above it, and the digging required to reach daylight was the work of people whose food had already been rationed for 5 days, who were burning the last of their furniture, who were discovering that the careful warmth of shared body heat in a sealed room has a limit, and they had reached it. The church ruin was visible above the snowpack. The warehouse stood. But when the men of the town finally shoveled their way to its doors and got them open, and held their lamps up and looked inside, they stood for a moment in the particular silence of people confronting something they cannot quite believe. A third of the grain was destroyed, perhaps more. In the cold and the dim light with the wall of destruction visible in the lamp glow, it did not look like mold and ice and ruined burlap. It looked like the end of things. Voss was there. He stood and he looked at it. He did not speak. Arden Hale stood beside him and thought about a conversation he had almost started and had not started about timber and cure times and the behavior of greenwood in extreme cold. And he felt something in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite shame, but lived in the same country as both. The accounting that followed was done in the flat voice of men who are trying not to let the numbers mean what they mean. A third of the grain was gone confirmed. Perhaps more was contaminated and not yet visibly, so the mold having advanced deeper into the stack than the outer layer suggested. The remaining grain might last into January. Might, if rationing began immediately, strictly, without exception, January. It was the 9th day of November. The hunger began, not immediately, not catastrophically, not in the first days. It began the way cold begins, as something present at the edges of your awareness, something you can manage for now, something that will surely resolve. Then it is there in the mornings when you wake up. Then it is there throughout the days. Then it becomes the primary fact of existence, the thing that everything else is organized around, the context in which every other experience occurs. The old and the very young feel it first. This is how it always works. Roland Pruitt, who had signed a piece of paper that sent a 13-year-old girl to a mountain because a more powerful man told him to sat in his cold house and watch his wife ration the morning meal with the careful movements of someone who is trying to make the container of something hold more than it holds. He was a man who had made small compromises all his life and called them pragmatism, and built from them a life of moderate comfort and zero moral clarity. He was beginning to understand what those compromises had cost. He was not the only one. Arden Hale had a daughter 12 years old and a son 16, and a wife whose face was doing the thing that a mother's face does when she is calculating how to transfer her own share of food to her children without anyone noticing. He sat in his kitchen in the dark and looked at his hands. The hands that had built the warehouse. The hands that had said nothing about the green timber when saying something might have mattered. Crispin was his son, 16. A boy who thought more than he spoke and felt things more acutely than he showed. Crispin had been sitting with his family in their shrinking warmth and their shrinking stores for 9 days, and on the 9th day he had said something that stopped his father completely. He said, "Clara Ashwood is still alive up there." Arden looked at him. "I know she is," Crispin said. "I know it the way I know the weather. She built something up there that could hold against this. She had 2 years to prepare, and she was reading the mountain the whole time, and she didn't have anyone telling her not to listen to what she saw." His daughter was sitting in the corner by the last of the morning's heat. She was 12 years old, and she had eaten almost nothing for 3 days, and she was the specific pale of a child whose body is consuming itself. Arden Hale looked at his daughter. He looked at his son. "The warehouse," he said. His voice sounded wrong in his own ears, like something said by a man who is only now understanding the full meaning of his own actions. I know, Crispin said. I know about the timber dad. Everyone knows now. He was not accusing. He was simply stating a fact in the way of someone who has moved past the point where accusation and blame are the primary concerns. Someone has to go up there, Crispin said. It's 2 days in this snow, Arden said. Maybe more. Yes, Crispin said. A long silence. You'd die out there. Maybe, Crispin said, but Ada is going to die in here. Another silence. Arden Hale was not a man of fine moral gestures. He was a craftsman, a builder, a man whose goodness was practical rather than principled. He had spent his life making things that worked, and his greatest failure had been making something that did not work and saying nothing. He was not sure he could repair that now, but he was sure of one thing. He would not be the reason his son did not try. He said, "Go see Emmett Calhoun first, before you go anywhere." Old Calhoun was still alive. He was in his small house at the edge of town in his bed under every blanket he owned alive in the technical sense, and not much more. He was 71 years old, and 3 weeks of the most extreme cold he had experienced in a life full of extreme cold had extracted something from him that he was not going to get back. Crispin found him in the late afternoon of the 9th day. He sat beside the old man's bed and he explained what he intended to do. Calhoun listened with his eyes half closed. Then he asked Crispin to bring him the leather satchel from the shelf beside the door. Inside the satchel was a hand-drawn map done in Calhoun's clean, practiced hand. He had drawn it, he told Crispin, 2 months ago, after he had heard the latest trapper's report about the girl and the entrance to her mountain home and the smoke that rose from the ridge on cold days. He had drawn it because he was a man who believed in preparation, and also because he had believed since October's ceremony that a moment would come when someone would need to know the way. He handed it to Crispin. "She'll be there," he said. His voice was very quiet. "She's been right about everything. She was right and I was right, and we were the only two people in this valley who were, and neither one of us was listened to." He paused. "Make sure she knows, not about being right, about her father." Crispin looked at him. "Her father was a good man," Calhoun said. "He knew what was in that mountain. He tried to tell Voss. Before the accident, before he went up the ridge that last time. He came to me after Voss turned him away. We talked about the thermal system, about what it could mean for the whole valley if someone built with it rather than against it. He was going back up to gather more evidence. He thought if he had enough data, Voss would listen." He closed his eyes. "He didn't come back down," Calhoun said. "The mountain kept him, but the mountain also kept his work and his daughter. Remember that. The mountain kept what mattered." Crispin sat with the old man until he slept. He did not know when he left the small house with the map in his coat that Emmett Calhoun would not wake again, that he would die quietly in his sleep before the storm fully broke, that he would not live to see whether he had been right. He died having given everything useful he had to the person who needed it. Crispin gathered 3 other young men the next morning. They fashioned snowshoes from floorboards. They took no food because there was none to take. They went out into the white. The journey was everything Arden had said it would be, and worse. The snow was not simply deep. It was deep and crusted in places and soft in others, in a pattern that defied prediction, so that every step required its full attention. Each transfer of weight, a calculation that the body made and sometimes got wrong. They sank to their hips in some places. In others, the crust held for a step and then gave way with a sudden drop that jarred the spine. The temperature was the other thing. 20 below was the number, though numbers do not carry the meaning. 20 below is a cold that goes past the outer body and reaches for the interior, that bypasses the usual pain signals, and presence instead is a strange clarifying sensation, an eerie sharpness of perception that is the body's last attempt to organize itself before it begins to fail. 2 miles out of Greystone, one of the young men made the decision to turn back. His right foot had stopped communicating with him in the normal way, and he was experienced enough to understand what that meant. He turned without drama and went back the way he had come. 3 of them continued. At the base of the ridge, the terrain changed. The slope here was brutal, not simply steep, but irregular. The snow covering what were in reality large, unstable rock formations, so that what looked like a continuous surface was in fact a series of concealed gaps and drops that had to be navigated by feel and by Calhoun's map, which Crispin held in his coat pocket and consulted in brief exposures, folding it back against the cold to preserve its legibility. 2 hours up the ridge, the second man went down. Not dramatically. He simply sat down in the snow and said he couldn't feel his hands and was going to rest for a moment. Crispin had seen enough to know that sitting down in this cold was not resting. He and the third man got him upright and moving. They kept him moving for another quarter-mile until they reached an overhang where the wind was broken enough to be survivable. They left him there with instructions to move continuously and come back the way they came as soon as he was able. Then there were two. The third man lasted another 40 minutes before his legs stopped doing what he asked of them, with the reliability required by the terrain. He sat down in the snow and Crispin looked at him for a moment and then looked up the slope. The smoke was not visible. The entrance was somewhere above in the undifferentiated white. Crispin went on alone. He could not feel his feet. He was not thinking about Clara Ashwood or the warehouse or his father or what it meant that he was here, one person on a mountain in 20 below zero cold, looking for something he was not certain existed. He was thinking about one foot and then the other foot. He was thinking about the map, which showed the juniper stand and the rock formation above it in the entrance somewhere behind the junipers. He was thinking about Ada's face and the specific pale of a child who was running out of reserves. He found the junipers. He pushed through them. He could not feel his hands well enough to know if he was gripping the branches or simply pressing against them with the dead weight of his arms. He went through sideways the way the map said into the dark behind the screening growth. The warmth hit him like something physical. Not dramatic warmth, not heat. Just the difference between 20 below and something inhabitable. Air that was not trying to kill him. He stood in it for a moment and breathed it in with the desperation of a drowning man surfacing. Then his legs gave out and he went down in the entrance of the tunnel. He was trying to call out, but his voice was not cooperating, and the cold had gotten into his chest in a way that made the muscles of speech unreliable. He managed something, a sound, not a name, just a sound. He heard movement from somewhere inside. He felt rather than saw the lamp come close. He felt rather than saw the person who appeared at the tunnel entrance and looked at him. What he felt next was hands. Small, very strong, very sure. Taking hold of him and pulling with Sage's help and her own further into the warmth. He opened his eyes. There was light, pale, diffuse silvery, and against it green. Living green, impossible and abundant in the middle of the killing winter, growing from dark soil in the belly of the mountain. And Clara Ashwood, 15 years old, standing over him with a lamp in one hand and those careful eyes reading the damage and calculating what needed to be done. She did not say his name. She did not ask what had happened or where he had come from or what had taken them so long to understand. She simply turned and went to the cooking area and began heating water. The first thing Crispin Hale felt was warmth. Not the warmth of a fire which has direction, which exists in one place and demands that you position yourself toward it. This was different. This was ambient, surrounding total. The kind of warmth that the body receives like a correction, like the restoration of something that should never have been taken away. It came up from the ground and down from the low ceiling and sideways from the walls, and it wrapped around him with a completeness that made him understand for the first time what cold had actually done to him. He lay on his back on the chamber floor and he breathed. Above him, the mica panels gathered what pale light existed outside and passed it inward, pooling it in the soft silver that he had noticed from the tunnel entrance. In that light, the green of the growing beds was extraordinary. Not the flat green of summer fields wide and expected. A concentrated green, specific and deliberate, the green of things that have been carefully tended in a place where they have no business existing. Kale in its winter flush, dark and substantial. Mushrooms along the far wall, tidy and gray-capped. Above the potato beds, dense foliage pressing upward from the warm soil. He had not seen living plants in 3 weeks. He had not understood until this moment how much the absence of them had cost him. Clara moved around him with the practiced efficiency of someone in a familiar workspace. She did not treat him as a patient exactly, though what she did was the work of care. She stripped his outer layers with the matter-of-fact speed of someone who understood that wet, cold clothing against a warming body was its own danger. She replaced them with goat hides, dense and warm, wrapping them around him with a methodology that suggested she had thought about this had, perhaps in some part of her preparation for winter, imagined that someone might arrive in this condition and considered in advance what would need to be done. She retrieved the two men he had described from the entrance tunnel, where they had been half-conscious in the wind shadow he had found before going down. This required Sage's assistance, the mare moving with the steady, unflappable purpose that had characterized her since Clara had first worked her into the mountain's rhythms 2 years ago. The men were dragged gently on a flat sled of Clara's construction into the chamber's warmth, three figures lying on the chamber floor. Clara moved between them, checking hands and feet for the white and waxy color that meant damage too deep to reverse, checking breathing, checking the pupils of their eyes. She packed the places where frostbite had begun its work, with a poultice she had prepared from dried herbs her mother had cataloged in the journal plants, whose properties Nora Ashwood had documented with the thoroughness of a naturalist who believed knowledge was only as useful as its application. She heated water in the clay pot over the small cooking fire near the entrance passage. She made broth, not the thin, apologetic broth of limited resources, but a real broth deep with the flavor of the dried rabbit meat she had stored in October, enriched with kale and the bulb vegetables she had harvested in September. She had been eating well all winter. It was strange to remember that, while the valley below had been rationing and then suffering and then starving, she had been here in the mountain's warmth, eating real food, sleeping in warmth, tending her garden, maintaining her routines. She had not known precisely what was happening below. Looking at Crispin's face as the warmth came back into it, looking at the specific hollow of his cheeks and the sharpness of his eyes that meant the body had been burning its reserves for some time, she understood that it had been bad. Bad, was still bad for everyone who was not in this room. She filled 3 cups. She helped each man to drink slowly in the way of someone who understood that a starving body needs to be reintroduced to food rather than confronted with it. She did not speak. Crispin came back into full consciousness in the late afternoon, judging by the quality of the light through the mica panels, which she had learned to read as reliably as a clock. He sat up slowly, looked around, took in the chamber with the systematic attention of someone whose mind had returned and was now processing what his eyes were giving it. He looked at Clara. She was sitting at the edge of the kale bed, with her mother's journal open in her lap, making the daily notations she had not interrupted, despite his arrival, recording the chamber temperature and the condition of the growing beds and the behavior of the goats in the adjoining section. She did this every evening. She had done it every evening for 2 years. An observer, a recorder, a person who believed in the discipline of consistent documentation because her father had believed in it and because she had seen what that belief produced. She did not look up immediately. She finished the notation she was making. Then she looked up. He said, "I am sorry about the day they sent you away. I know I gave you the seeds. I know it was not enough. I watched them do it, and I gave you seeds, and I told myself that was something. It was not enough." Clara looked at him for a moment. He was 16 years old and had just walked most of the way up a mountain in 20 below zero cold, with no food and inadequate equipment, because his sister was dying and he had run out of other options. He had given her seeds when he was the only person in Greystone who thought to give her anything. He had in this specific and limited way been the best of them. She said, "Eat something first, then tell me what they need." He looked at her. The quality of his looking was the look of a person encountering something that reorganizes his understanding of what people can be. He said, "How much do you have?" She said, "Enough for more people than are here." He left the next morning. His companions were not yet strong enough to travel, and she let them stay, moving them to the partitioned area near Sage's section, where they would be warmest, feeding them at regular intervals, with the patient methodology of someone who understood recovery as a process with stages rather than a moment. Crispin she outfitted as well as she could. Extra wrappings from her supply of goat hide, 2 portions of food dense and sustaining wrapped in oilcloth. The route back down was easier than the route up, gravity working in his favor, his body restored to something closer to functional. She watched him go into the entrance tunnel, and then she went back to her garden. She checked the kale. She checked the mushroom beds. She checked the thermal channel's morning temperature, which was consistent, which it always was, which was the fundamental fact on which everything else depended. She milked the goats. She fed Sage. Then she sat at the entrance of the tunnel and she thought. What was coming, she understood, was not 3 people. Not 10. The man who had just walked down the mountain would carry what he had seen back to a starving town. And what he had seen was the thing that starving people most need to see, which is evidence that survival is possible. That it exists somewhere, that it is not abstract, but actual and warm and smelling of broth and growing things. They would come. She did not feel triumph at this thought. She had examined herself for that feeling in the months of isolation, the months of hearing the echoes of mockery from the valley below, and she had found something more complicated and more durable. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter. She felt sitting at the entrance of the home she had built in the mountain that was supposed to kill her a simple and complete willingness to share what she had, to teach what she knew, to receive the people who had sent her away and give them what the mountain had given her. Not because they deserved it, because she did not want to be the kind of person who measured out survival according to who deserved it. She thought of her father's handwriting on the last page of the journal. The mountain doesn't forgive pride, but it rewards patience. She thought of what patience actually meant, not passivity, not waiting, but the sustained and active willingness to work towards something whose results you could not see, to trust the process when the process offered no immediate confirmation to keep going, when the going was its own argument for stopping. She had been patient for 2 years. Now there was work to do. They came on the second day after Crispin's departure. The first family arrived in the early afternoon. A man, a woman, 3 children, the youngest carried on the father's back in a makeshift wrap. They came through the juniper stand with the careful, desperate movement of people who have been told something is here and are not entirely certain they believe it and are too far beyond alternatives to let that uncertainty stop them. Clara met them at the entrance. She did not make speeches. She did not say anything that referenced what had come before. She said, "Come in, sit down. There is warm food." The woman looked at the chamber, at the green of the growing beds, at the lamp's light on the mica panels, at the steady, impossible 55-degree air. She made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, but carried the content of both. Clara guided them to the warmest section of the chamber and went to heat broth. By the second day, there were 12 people. By the fourth day, 23. By the end of the first week, she had lost count, in the sense that counting had become less useful than managing. The chamber was full in the way of a living thing, full of breath and body heat, in the low continuous sound of people who are recovering from something and are not yet sure they have recovered. Children lay wrapped in goat hides in the corner closest to the thermal channel. Adults sat along the walls eating slowly, learning to pace themselves with food after days, without it their bodies relearning the process with the careful incremental logic of systems being restarted. Clara organized them. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing about what followed. Not the food, not the warmth, not even the garden, which represented 2 years of sustained and solitary labor. What was remarkable was the quality of her authority, the way she moved through the crowded chamber, issuing instructions that were followed without question, not because she demanded it, but because she was manifestly and completely the person who understood this place. She showed the women and the older children how to harvest kale without damaging the growth nodes, how to leave the plant in a condition to recover and produce again. She showed them the mushroom beds, the rhythm of their cultivation, the signs of health, and the signs of problem. She divided the labor of the chamber with a fairness so absolute and so unsentimental that it was followed as naturally as gravity. She showed the men, those strong enough, how to set snares in the terrain outside the cave entrance, in the specific places where the geothermal activity kept a narrow band of the mountain surface, ice-free where the snowshoe hares moved in their reliable patterns. She showed them the section of the river at the base of the ridge where the thermal springs outflow kept a stretch of water open through the worst of the cold, and where below the surface of that water, fish moved in their winter suspension. Arden Hale came on the 5th day. He arrived alone. He had sent his family ahead, with the first group staying behind in Greystone for reasons he would later find difficult to explain, with precision some mixture of responsibility and shame, some sense that he had no right to claim rescue ahead of the people whose situation he had partly caused. When he finally came up the mountain, he came slowly, an older man in difficult conditions, and he arrived at the chamber entrance in worse shape than his son had been. Clara brought him in and fed him, and said nothing about anything that had passed between them. When he was warm and fed, and his hands had come back to him, he looked at the chamber walls. He looked at the timbering of the ceiling, the angle and spacing of the supports, the way the joints had been made to account for the rock's irregularity. He looked at the thermal channel and the way it had been routed to maximize the chamber's warmth. He looked at the entrance passage and the way it had been designed to break the wind before the wind reached the main chamber. He was a builder. He looked at what she had built. He did not say anything right away. He sat with what he was looking at for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me how you did this, all of it. I want to understand every decision." Clara looked at him. She said, "Start with the timbering. That is the most important." He nodded. He listened with the complete attention of a man who has decided that he is done with the version of himself that let his expertise become a form of pride. He asked questions that were real questions, not the questions of a man performing interest, but the questions of a craftsman genuinely trying to understand a technique he has not encountered. She answered all of them. On the ninth day, Harlan Voss came. He came last, as she had somehow known he would not from cowardice. She did not think it was cowardice, but from something more complicated. He was a man who had organized his entire life around a particular understanding of himself and what he was walking toward. On Cinder Ridge was the complete and irreversible dismantling of that understanding. He came alone. She saw him from the entrance passage moving up the slope in the thin light of a late afternoon, a man in his middle 50s who had once carried himself with the ease of someone who believed the ground beneath him was permanently solid. He did not carry himself that way now. The storm and the hunger and the 3 weeks of watching his certainty fail in the most concrete possible terms had altered something in his posture that no amount of recovery would entirely restore. He was not the same man who had stood on the platform outside his warehouse and declared that Providence had smiled. He found the entrance. He came through the juniper curtain and stood in the passage and looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the chamber were audible behind her. The low voices of the people gathered there. Children, the occasional movement of sage in her section, the steady drip of the thermal channel. Voss said, "I need to tell you something before I go in there." Clara waited. He said, "Your father came to me. Before he went up the ridge the last time. Before the accident. He came to me with his survey data about this mountain and what it could mean for the whole valley if someone built with it rather than against it. He proposed a partnership, community development, using the thermal system as a foundation for something different than what Greystone was." He stopped. He looked at the rock wall of the passage. "I turned him down," he said. "I told him it was impractical. I told him the geology was speculative and the investment required was not justified. But that is not entirely why I turned him down. I turned him down because what he was proposing required me to share the direction of something, and I had spent 14 years not sharing the direction of anything." His voice had lost all its carrying quality. It was the voice of a man speaking in a register he had rarely used, which was the register of truth, without audience management. He went up the mountain to gather more evidence, Voss said. He thought if he had enough data, I would listen. He believed data could move me. Clara said nothing. A week after he went up, Voss said, his voice very quiet, a trapper came through and said there had been a rock slide on the north face. A significant one. I sent 2 men to look. Clara went very still. They found evidence of a camp and evidence of a slide, Voss said. They did not find your parents. I made the decision that we had seen enough, that a formal search was not likely to change the outcome. He paused. I also made the decision not to tell the town what the trapper had said or what my men had found. He looked at her. I told him it was an accident. I told him there was no way of knowing what had happened. What I knew was that your father had been going to a place I had told him held no value to gather evidence for a proposal I had rejected, and that if the full story came to light, there would be questions I did not want to answer. The passage was very quiet. Clara stood in it and breathed. She had not known this. In 2 years on the mountain, in all the careful processing of grief and loss, and the relentless forward motion that survival required, she had carried the version of the story that Greystone had offered her, which was that her parents had gone up the mountain, and the mountain had kept them an accident, an act of indifferent nature. The truth was more jagged than that. She stood with it. Voss said, I am not asking for forgiveness. I am telling you because you deserve to know the truth of it, and because I am done with the version of myself that managed information for the sake of self-preservation. The chamber sounds continued behind her. People. Living, recovering people in the warm interior of the mountain her father had prepared. The mountain that had kept his work alive, even when it could not keep him. She thought of his handwriting. The mountain doesn't forgive pride, but it rewards patience. She looked at Harlan Voss for a long time. Then she said, my father believed this mountain could sustain people. That was the last thing he was trying to prove. He was right. That is what I want you to carry. Not the other part. The fact that he was right. Voss looked at her with the expression of a man who has expected less than he has received and does not quite know what to do with the difference. Clara stepped back from the entrance. Come in, she said. There is food, and when you are recovered, there is work to be done, and I will need every set of hands. The thaw came in the last days of March, 1889. It came slowly as thaws do, the temperature climbing in increments over the course of a week, the snowpack settling and shifting before it began its actual retreat. The world that emerged from beneath it was not the world that had gone under. The survivors came down from Cinder Ridge in the first days of April. 61 people. Of the 94 who had been in Greystone when the storm hit, 40 survived the first weeks in the valley before making the journey to the mountain. Of those, 43 had died in the chamber from injuries and weaknesses too advanced to be reversed. 61 walked down the ridge in the April light and looked at what remained of Greystone. The clock tower was gone, its base, all that was visible above the settled snow. Several houses had collapsed under the accumulated weight of the snowpack. The warehouse stood, its walls intact, its interior empty and smelling of mold and cold air and ruin. The church was a foundation and a scattering of timber. They stood in the ruins of the life they had built, and they were quiet for a long time. A week later, they gathered in the shell of the ruined church. The walls still stood mostly. The roof was sky. The April sun came through where the ceiling had been and fell on the people seated on the beams and stones that served as benches, and it was cold still, but a different cold, a cold with the memory of warmth in it, a seasonal cold rather than an absolute one. Harlan Voss stood. He did not go to the front of the room the way he once would have with the ease of a man assuming his position. He stood where he was in the middle of the assembly, and he turned slowly so that he was visible to everyone around him. And then he looked at Clara. She was sitting at the edge of the gathering. She was 15 years old. She was wearing the practical clothing of someone who has spent 2 years on a mountain and has no investment in appearances. Her face was calm in the way it was always calm, that quality of interior stillness that the people who had spent weeks in the chamber with her had come to recognize as something different from passivity, as the stillness of a person whose attention was fully and continuously engaged. Voss said I called her a fool. I was the fool. The ruined church was very quiet. He said I built my warehouse with $4,000 and 14 years of experience, and the complete conviction that I knew what I was doing. She built her home with a dead man's tools and 2 years of solitary labor. Mine became a tomb for everything we needed. Hers became the only reason any of us are standing here. He paused. I rejected her father's proposal and called it impractical. What he proposed would have built something like what she built, but for all of us from the beginning. We could have had it. We chose not to. We chose to believe that the way we already did things was sufficient. He looked around the ruined walls. He said, I have money remaining. Not what I had, but something. I have these hands. I have whatever is left of my experience, such as it is after this winter. What I no longer have is the certainty that my judgment is better than the people around me. He looked back at Clara. I am asking you to teach us, not as a courtesy, as a necessity, because the way we built before will kill us if we build that way again. Roland Pruitt beside the ruined altar was weeping with the complete unself-conscious weeping of a man who has passed through something that burned away everything he used to use to manage his emotions. He did not try to stop or hide it. Arden Hale sat with his hands in his lap, looking at the floor. His daughter Ada was beside him, recovered color returned to her face. His son Crispin was on the other side, watching Clara with the expression of someone watching a thing they were glad they had gone out into the cold to find. Clara stood. She stood and she looked at the people around her, and she thought of her father proposing to a man who would not listen, climbing a mountain to gather evidence for a truth that deserved to be heard, and the mountain keeping him. She thought of her mother's precise handwriting in the field journal, the careful documentation of properties and processes, and the natural world's patient logic. She thought of old Calhoun drawing a map in his cold bed, knowing the map was for a journey he would not take. She thought of Crispin pressing a bag of seeds into her hand in the early morning of her exile, saying nothing, just giving her what he had. She said, "Wisdom is only worth what it is shared." She said it simply, without weight or drama, as a statement of fact rather than a moral. "Come, I will show you everything." The rebuilding took 2 full seasons, not the rebuilding of Greystone. Greystone was not rebuilt. The Valley site was abandoned by common agreement, a decision that came not from any formal vote, but from the collective understanding that the Valley's exposure and the architecture that exposure had encouraged were not problems to be solved by better construction. They were problems to be solved by different thinking. They built on the skirting slope below Cinder Ridge. The new structures were not houses in the traditional sense. They were earth-sheltered homes built into the hillside itself, using the mountain's mass as insulation, oriented to take advantage of the geothermal activity that Clara's father had mapped in such detail and that Clara had spent 2 years learning to use. Arden Hale designed them, and he designed them differently than he had ever designed anything before. Not with the bold vertical ambition of a man building monuments to his own craft, but with the horizontal embedded intelligence of a builder who has learned to ask the land what it will support. Clara reviewed every design. This was not a formality. She walked the slope with Hale, reading the subtle indicators her father had taught her, the micro-topography that suggested thermal pockets, the mineral deposits that indicated subsurface heat pathways, the drainage patterns that would determine structural viability through freeze and thaw cycles. She marked the sites. She approved the orientations. Hale built what she specified. He told people afterward, in the specific voice of a craftsman's deepest honesty, that the homes he built on that slope in 1889 and 1890 were the best work of his life, not the most beautiful by the standards of what he had once called beauty, the most sound, the most truthful, the most genuinely suited to their purpose. He meant it. Voss contributed his remaining capital without reservation, not as investment, not as the foundation of a commercial relationship, but as what it was, which was a man paying a debt he could never fully pay and doing what he could anyway. Tools, materials, a team of craftsmen hired from the regional settlements to supplement Greystone's own reduced labor force. He worked alongside them. He did not manage them. He worked. Something had changed in Harlan Voss that the people around him observed in the specific way that real change is observable, not as a performance of different behavior, but as the absence of something that had previously been constant. The ease of certainty, the fluency of a man who has never needed to question his own conclusions. That was gone. In its place was something more effortful and less comfortable, and to the people who watched it, considerably more trustworthy. He deferred. He asked. He listened when the answer was different from what he had assumed. He never fully became a simple man. He was too complex for that too, formed by decades of a particular way of moving through the world. But he became a different version of the man he had been, and the difference was real. The community that assembled on the slope of Cinder Ridge in the summer and fall of 1889 was not the community that had occupied the valley. It was smaller. It was more capable. It had been through something that either breaks people or changes them, and the people who remained had changed. Clara taught them. She taught them everything she had learned and everything her parents had documented in the journals that had become the community's foundational text. The geothermal system, its behavior and maintenance, and the indicators that suggested changes in its activity. The growing methods adapted now for the larger scale of the community's earth-sheltered growing spaces. The animal behavior patterns that served as early warning systems for extreme weather. The instrument-based observations that supplemented what could be learned by eye and feel. She taught the children especially. Not in the formal way of a schoolroom, though Greystone had once had a schoolroom, and the new settlement would eventually build another. She taught them in the direct way her parents had taught her, by walking, by standing in a place and learning to read what it was saying. She showed them how to hold a barometric instrument and what the numbers meant. She showed them how to watch a marmot colony in August and what changes in its behavior indicated. She showed them the mica panels and explained the optics her mother had described, the principles that governed reflection and amplification of light. She wanted them to understand the principles, not just the methods, because methods without principles are instructions that fail when circumstances change while principles without methods are knowledge that cannot act. Her parents had given her both, and she gave both. Crispin Hale became her recorder. He had his father's eye for structure and his own instinct for language, and he began, without being asked to document what Clara taught, to write it in the clear, organized prose of someone who understood that documentation is a form of respect, that recording knowledge is the act of insisting it should survive. He filled 3 journals in the first year alone. Clara read every page. She corrected him when he was imprecise. She added where he had missed nuance. She drew diagrams to supplement his text in the careful, precise style her father had used. She never spoke of what had been lost. Her father on the mountain, her mother, the 2 years of exile that should have been childhood. She carried those things the way she carried everything internally processed rather than displayed converted through some alchemy of character into the fuel that sustained her forward motion. But once, in the autumn of 1889, sitting in the entrance of the original chamber after a long day of teaching, watching the harvest light on the slope below, she opened her father's journal to the last page. Crispin was there nearby, not intruding. She read the line, "The mountain doesn't forgive pride, but it rewards patience." She sat with it for a while. Then she said to Crispin without looking up, he was right about this place. He knew it before anyone would listen. Crispin said, "They're listening now." Clara closed the journal. She said that has to be enough. In the spring of 1890, the territorial government processed the community's request. The name Greystone was retired from the official maps of Montana Territory. The valley site was noted as uninhabited. On the slope of Cinder Ridge were 61 survivors and the newcomers, who had followed news of the settlement, had built something that bore no architectural resemblance to what had come before a new name appeared. Ashwood Crossing. The request had come from the community, and it had not been contested by anyone, not by Roland Pruitt, who signed the documentation in his official capacity, not by Harlan Voss, who had been consulted, not by any of the former residents of Greystone who still remained. It had been unanimous in the way of things that are simply true and require no argument. Clara was shown the document when it arrived. She looked at it for a moment. The print was formal, the language of governance, the name written in the clean type of official correspondence. Ashwood Crossing. She handed the document back. She said, "Good." She meant it as a tribute, but not to herself. She meant it for the man who had climbed this mountain with his instruments and his journals and his unshakable belief in what the earth could offer if approached with honesty and patience. She meant it for the woman who had pressed plants between the pages of her field journal and documented the natural world with a thoroughness that had, in the end, helped feed 60 people through the worst winter in living memory. She meant it for 2 people who had trusted the mountain, and the mountain had kept. Clara Ashwood lived to be 78 years old. She died in the spring, which seemed right, in the simple, warm home she had built adjacent to the original chamber, the structure she had made with her own hands at the age of 13 in the first impossible winter of her exile. The chamber itself was preserved as the community had voted to preserve it. Its growing beds maintained, its mica panels kept in the positions she had established, its thermal channel running, as it had run without interruption since she had first diverted it. She was buried in the meadow below the settlement beside Sage, whose grave had been there for many years. The grass above them, both thick and green, fed by the thermal spring's gentle outflow, blooming early each year, when the surrounding terrain was still releasing winter. People came from settlements throughout the territory for the funeral. Not because of her wealth, which was modest, not because of her power, which she had never formally held, because of what she had built and what she had taught and what those things had made possible for the people around her. Arden Hale, very old by then, stood beside her grave and said nothing for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, to the spring air and the early flowers, in the slope above where the earth-sheltered homes stood in their quiet permanence. She was right, the whole time, about all of it. Crispin Hale, his son, who had walked up a mountain in 20 below zero cold and been pulled from the snow by a 15-year-old girl's careful hands, had the journals published in a single volume the following year. 3 of Clara's, 4 of his own documentation of her teaching, and the original field journals of Edmund and Nora Ashwood, the geological surveys, and the naturalist observations that had preceded and made possible everything that followed. The volume was used in the territory's agricultural schools for 2 decades. The original Gopher's Palace, as it continued to be known, despite, or perhaps because of the mockery encoded in the name, welcomed visitors throughout the decades of Clara's life and after it. People came to see the mica panels in the thermal channel in the growing beds. To stand in the 55-degree air in the middle of January and feel what it meant to have been right about something when no one else was willing to believe it. To understand in their bodies as well as their minds that the earth offers what it offers regardless of whether we are humble enough to accept it. In Ashwood Crossing, the phrase had long since completed its transformation. Going Ashwood. It had begun as mockery, a way of describing someone who wasted their effort on an impossible project, a way of saying that a person had lost their mind to a fool's dream. It meant something else entirely now. To go Ashwood was to build for the world as it is, not as you wish it were. To trust the evidence of patient observation over the comfort of confident assumptions. To prepare for the winter you might face, not the winter you hope to face. To know the difference between pride and wisdom. And to have the patience, the sustained and active and demanding patience, to let wisdom do its work. They built for the world they wanted. She built for the world as it is. Only one approach survived.